To the world, Billy Graham was a towering figure, America's pastor. The man who preached to millions across continents, counseled presidents, and became a symbol of evangelical Christianity in the 20th century. His crusades filled stadiums, his sermons were broadcast worldwide, and his name carried an almost saint-like weight in Christian households. But behind the pulpit and away from the cameras, Billy Graham was also a husband and a father of 5 children who grew up under the heavy shadow of his fame. For Virginia, Gigi Graham. Anne Graham Lotz, Ruth Graham, affectionately called Bunny William Franklin Graham III, known simply as Franklin, and the youngest, Nelson. Ned Graham life at home was far from ordinary. While their father spent much of his time on the road, preaching to crowds that numbered in the tens of thousands, their mother Ruth quietly shouldered the task of raising the family, instilling faith discipline and resilience into each of her children. To outsiders, the Graham household may have looked like the very definition of a picture-perfect Christian family, devout, orderly, blessed. But the reality was far more complex. Each of Billy and Ruth's children wrestled with their own battles: rebellion, broken hearts, public failures, and the pressure of carrying a name that meant so much to millions of strangers. Their lives proved that even in the most admired families, there are struggles, doubts, and scars hidden behind the public image. Some of the Graham children ran hard in the opposite direction of their father's teachings before eventually finding their way back. Others endured heartbreaks that tested their faith, like devastating divorces or the pain of personal loss. And yet, through it all, each of Billy Graham's 5 children forged a unique path shaped by the legacy of their father, but also defined by their own choices and resilience. Some became powerful Christian voices in their own right, while others preferred quieter lives of service or family devotion. This is not just the story of Billy Graham, the preacher who changed the world. It is the story of Gigi, Anne, Ruth, Franklin, and Ned, the children, who lived behind the headlines, who bore both the blessings and burdens of being born into a family synonymous with faith. Their journeys show us that faith is not inherited easily. It is tested, questioned, and often found only after walking through valleys of rebellion, heartbreak, and redemption. And it begins with the eldest, Virginia Gigi Graham, whose youthful impulsiveness led her into a marriage at just 17, a move that would take her across the ocean and into a life far more difficult than she could have imagined. It was a lot to handle. Before long, Gigi and Stephen fled back to the United States, seeking a fresh start, away from that stifling environment. They settled into a more ordinary life. And over the years, Gigi became a mother to 7 children. Yes, 7. Which by itself is a monumental calling. She raised a big family, usually blessing her parents with many grandchildren, and tried to live a quiet life in the mountains of North Carolina. But quiet wasn't always peaceful. Gigi struggled with depression amid the stresses of young motherhood and the expectations that came with her famous last name. While Billy was off preaching to thousands, Gigi was at home changing diapers and cooking meals, likely wondering where her place and purpose were. In those tough years, Gigi discovered an outlet in writing. She would jot down her thoughts and prayers on scraps of paper between household tasks. Those scribbles slowly turned into stories and reflections. Over time, to her own surprise, Gigi completed book after book, ultimately publishing 10 books on faith, family, and life. Her personal journaling blossomed into a ministry of its own. By candidly sharing her struggles and insights, she connected with countless readers and listeners who appreciated her authenticity. Gigi found herself emerging from the shadows not as Billy's daughter, but as an inspirational speaker and author in her own right. She began speaking at churches and conferences across the U.S. and even in Europe, encouraging others with the hard-earned wisdom from her journey. Meanwhile, her personal life had further ups and downs. After decades of marriage, Gigi and Stefan divorced, marking another painful chapter. In the wake of that heartbreak, Gigi eventually remarried and then divorced again. By this point, she sometimes joked that she'd earned a PhD in marital challenges, but she never gave up on the idea of love or on her faith. Finally, in 2012, Gigi married her childhood friend, Jim Wilson, a man who had known the Graham family for years. In fact, Jim was the son of T.W. Wilson, who had been one of Billy Graham's closest ministry partners. It was as if Gigi's life came full circle. After all the drama, she found stability and companionship with someone who had been a familiar face since childhood. Today, Virginia G. Graham lives a contented life in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Now in her late 70s, she is the proud matriarch of a huge family, mother of 7, grandmother of 20, and she continues to share her story with grace and humor. Number 4. Anne Graham Lotz. Born in 1948, and from early on she seemed destined to follow in her father's footsteps, though she'd carve her own way to get there. Billy Graham himself once said that Anne is the best preacher in the family. That's high praise coming from a man who preached to millions. But, interestingly, Anne prefers to call herself a Bible teacher, rather than a preacher, perhaps to avoid ruffling feathers in more traditional circles. Make no mistake, though, Anne has preached, taught, and inspired people all over the world, earning respect entirely on her own merit. Anne's life might look polished on the outside. She founded a ministry, wrote best-selling books, and was often seen by her father's side at crusades. But her journey had humble and challenging beginnings. Like her older sister, Anne married young. In fact, she was just 18 when she wed Dr. Daniel Lotz, a local dentist. By age 20, Anne was already a mother, balancing diapers and feeding schedules with being a pastor's daughter. Before long, she had 3 children to raise. In those early years, Anne felt something many young moms do, a sense of drifting, like she'd lost herself while caring for everyone else. She later admitted she was hungry for a deeper purpose and a more personal faith beyond just being Billy Graham's daughter or Danny Lotz's wife. That hunger led her to join a Bible study fellowship class, basically a deep group Bible study, and it transformed her life. As Anne dug into Scripture, she rediscovered her passion and gifting for teaching God's Word. The more she learned, the more she wanted to share. Soon, Anne was asked to teach the class, and her knack for explaining the Bible was unmistakable. She had a clarity and fire in her speaking that moved listeners. Word got around, and before she knew it, Anne was leading Bible studies for hundreds of women. This eventually led her to launch her own organization, Angel Ministries. The initials AGL are also her initials, which allowed her to reach even more people with her teaching. Starting in 2000, Anne began holding revival called Just Give Me Jesus. Massive arena events aimed especially at women, urging them to deepen their relationship with God. She took these revival across the United States and even overseas to a dozen countries, speaking to arenas full of people hungry for hope. Picture this. The daughter of Billy Graham, not in her father's shadow at all, but on center stage in her own right, passionately preaching or teaching, as she'd say to thousands. It's a testament to how powerfully Anne stepped into the calling that she once resisted. Anne also became an accomplished author, writing 11 books and counting on Christian living and Bible exposition. Her books like Just Give Me Jesus and The Light of His Presence have encouraged countless readers. She's even earned 6 honorary doctorates for her contributions to ministry. Not that she'll brag about that, but it shows the impact she's had. And despite being an evangelist's daughter in a time when women in the pulpit weren't always accepted, Anne never let that stop her. She embraced her gifts while remaining respectful. For instance, she used that title, Bible teacher, simply to keep the focus on the message, rather than any controversy. Life, however, threw Anne some curveballs in recent years. After 49 years of marriage, her beloved husband Danny passed away in 2015. Anne had been Danny's caregiver as he struggled with health issues, and losing him was a devastating blow. Just 3 years later, in 2018, Anne's father, Billy Graham, died at the age of 99. Another heartbreak, even if not unexpected. In the midst of grieving those two great losses, Anne faced her own health crisis. In 2018, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, a discovery that she said struck swiftly and unexpectedly, requiring immediate surgery and treatment. This was a huge test of faith for someone who had spent her life teaching others to trust God. Anne went through surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation in a fight for her life. She described it as a harrowing journey with painful treatments and moments of deep vulnerability. Yet true to form, Anne met this trial head-on with remarkable faith. She called her cancer battle an assignment from God, fuel for the fire of her faith, as she put it. "I have experienced triumph in some of the darkest places," Anne said, crediting the presence of the Holy Spirit with sustaining her through every chemo treatment. At her weakest, she felt God's strength carrying her. And by 2019, Anne completed her treatments and was declared cancer-free. She emerged from that valley with an even stronger conviction to share hope. Her message to others became, "Don't wait until you have a crisis to establish a relationship with God. When a crisis happens, there's no time for that. In other words, build your faith when times are good so it can carry you when times are hard." A lesson she learned in the hardest way. Today, Anne Graham Lotz continues to write, teach, and speak worldwide. She still serves on the board of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, carrying on her father's legacy while also charting her own course. Number 3. Ruth Graham. Born in 1950 and affectionately nicknamed Bunny in her younger years. If Gigi was the steady older sister and Anne the anointed teacher, Ruth was the family free spirit with a tender heart. Her life has perhaps been the most publicly turbulent of the Graham children, marked by deep sorrows, but also the emergence of a beautiful ministry of compassion. Ruth would be the first to tell you that being Billy Graham's daughter did not spare her from life's heartache. In fact, she might even say it added to it at times. As a young woman, Ruth married a man she deeply loved and spent 21 years with him, raising 3 children together. She assumed it was her happily ever after. But that marriage ended in a shattering divorce, the first in the Graham family. Ruth was devastated when she discovered her husband had been unfaithful to her. Imagine the pain not only dealing with betrayal and divorce, but also feeling the weight of being Billy Graham's daughter in a culture where at the time, divorce was viewed harshly in church circles. Ruth later admitted she was humiliated and tried to hide her pain, at first thinking she had to put on a perfect face as a Graham. She recalled covering up her hurt with spiritual platitudes, praying, quoting Bible verses, doing everything she thought a good Christian should do, yet still feeling empty and broken. The stigma and shame she felt were overwhelming. She even felt suicidal when her marriage fell apart. Ruth's parents, especially her father, initially urged her to reconcile and avoid divorce. Billy Graham was worried how a divorce in the family might hurt the ministry's example. Ruth understood his concern. They lived in a glass house, and she knew her troubles might become a public spectacle. But ultimately, the marriage could not be saved. In time, Ruth realized that countless Christian families experienced the same kind of pain, and that her divorce was barely a blip on the radar screen for most people. In other words, the world didn't end just because Billy Graham's daughter got divorced. This realization was freeing. It helped Ruth see that struggling doesn't make you a bad Christian. It makes you human. As she later put it, we all still have to work through the mess and muck of life. You can't just slap a Bible verse over a wound and expect it to heal. That honest perspective would soon define her calling. However, Ruth's trials weren't over. In a vulnerable state after her divorce, she rushed into a second marriage not long after. She married a handsome widower on a New Year's Eve against the advice of her family, hoping for a fresh start. It turned out to be a terrible mistake. She knew within 24 hours that she had married the wrong man. The relationship quickly became unhealthy and frightening. Within 5 weeks, Ruth fled that marriage as well, now carrying even more sorrow and regret. This was rock bottom for her. Twice married, twice divorced, feeling like she'd failed not only her family and God, but also herself. Ashamed and heartbroken, Ruth drove back to her parents' home in Monterey, North Carolina, not knowing what kind of reception she'd get. What happened next is something Ruth has shared as one of the most powerful moments of her life. She drove up that long mountain road to her mom and dad's house, her stomach knotted with fear and shame. But as she rounded the last bend of the driveway, there was her father, Billy Graham, standing outside waiting for her. He knew what had happened and why she'd come home. Ruth got out of the car, trembling, expecting to see disappointment in her dad's eyes. Instead, Billy walked up and wrapped his arms around his daughter and said simply, "Welcome home." In Ruth's own words, there was no shame. There was no blame. There was no condemnation. Just unconditional love. Billy Graham, the great evangelist, showed his daughter the pure grace that he had preached about for so long. Ruth was accepted and loved at her lowest point. That embrace, that unconditional love, healed something deep in Ruth's heart. She says that in that moment her father showed her what God's love is like, waiting for us with open arms, even when we feel like we're in ruins. It was a turning point for Ruth. It didn't instantly fix all her problems, but it gave her hope and a renewed purpose. In the years that followed, Ruth would marry again and again. Yes, she eventually had a third and even a fourth marriage by her late 50s. She jokingly calls herself a serial marrier, not something she's proud of, but she owns her story with candor. Her third marriage also fell apart after some years, which was incredibly painful. But by that time, Ruth had started to see a bigger picture. Maybe her experiences weren't wasted. Maybe they could be used to help others. In the midst of her third marriage crumbling, Ruth founded a ministry called Ruth Graham and Friends. She began organizing conferences specifically for people who felt wounded, broken, or judged in the church. People like herself who didn't have it all together. She wanted to create a space where it was okay to not be okay. Ruth often says she wants to give others the same grace her father gave her, and ultimately, the grace God gives. Through books and conferences, she started encouraging people to drop the mask of perfection. One of her books is tellingly titled, "In Every Pew Sits a Broken Heart," driving home the message that nobody's family is perfect, not even the Grahams. In 2009, after 2 more failed marriages, Ruth took a leap of faith and married for the 4th time to a former pastor who himself had a very troubled past. It was a controversial move. This man was facing serious legal issues at the time. But Ruth saw someone who needed grace just as she did. Remarkably, in 2010, she was ordained as a minister in a Baptist church, and her new husband was among those who proudly laid hands on her praying as she stepped into ministry. It was an unconventional path, to say the least, but it symbolized how far she'd come. The once wayward daughter of Billy Graham, now officially taking up the mantle to minister to others. Today, Ruth Graham lives in the peaceful Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, near her children and grandchildren. She is a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 8. And she continues to write and speak about God's mercy in the midst of pain. When Ruth speaks at conferences or church events, she's disarmingly open. She'll tell funny stories about her upbringing, like how her mom once used dog training tactics to wrangle her and her siblings. But she also speaks candidly about depression, divorce, and doubt. She reminds people that God doesn't love Billy Graham or his family any more than anyone else. In her words, "We're not a perfect family. We needed God's grace just like you." Number 2. William Franklin Graham III. Born in 1952 as Billy and Ruth's 4th child and eldest son, Franklin grew up under perhaps the brightest spotlight of all the kids. After all, many assumed he would be the heir to his father's ministry. But if you think Franklin was a saintly preacher's kid, think again. Franklin was a rebel, the classic wild child, especially in his teenage years. By his own admission and his family's playful recollections, young Franklin gave his parents plenty to worry about. He had long hair when his dad preferred crew cuts. He got poor grades in school, and he had a penchant for tobacco and alcohol that definitely did not fit the Graham image. Picture a famous evangelist's son sneaking cigarettes and beers. That was Franklin. He also had a love for speed and adventure. He rode loud motorcycles, and to this day, he still loves roaring around on his Harley. At home and in public, Franklin could be a handful. There's a humorous family story of him zooming off in Billy's car without permission, just being a teenager with a bit of a wild streak. His mother, Ruth Graham, once quipped that she spanked Franklin just about every day during one phase of his childhood. He just had that mischievous spark in him. It wasn't that Franklin didn't believe in God. He did, but he wasn't ready to fully surrender his life to the same mission as his father. He resisted the idea of preaching for quite a while. No doubt the expectations on him were enormous. Everywhere he went, people likely asked, "So are you going to be a preacher like your dad?" Franklin's response, if not said aloud, then shown through his actions, was basically, "Not anytime soon." Instead, Franklin found another outlet: action and adventure in service of others. In his early 20s, an opportunity came that started changing his trajectory. He met Bob Pierce, the founder of a Christian relief organization called Samaritan's Purse. And this meeting lit a spark in Franklin. Bob Pierce took Franklin under his wing and showed him the power of relief work, helping victims of disasters, aiding the poor, the very practical side of Christian love. Franklin connected with that hands-on mission immediately. It gave the thrill and purpose he craved without requiring him yet to stand behind a pulpit. In 1979, at just 27 years old, Franklin Graham became the president of Samaritan's Purse. It was a role that fit him like a glove. He wasn't preaching to stadiums, but he was flying airplanes full of relief supplies into war zones, riding on horseback to deliver aid in remote villages, and getting his hands dirty to help those in need. Franklin once said he felt most comfortable in a jean jacket and boots, working on the front lines, a far cry from his dad's suits and ties. Still, the pull of his father's evangelistic calling was never far behind. Throughout the 1980s, as Billy Graham grew older, he gradually started inviting Franklin to join him in ministry events. In 1989, Franklin preached at his first Billy Graham Evangelistic Association rally, essentially stepping into the role of an evangelist while still heading Samaritan's Purse. He wasn't the polished orator his father was. Franklin's style was, and is, more blunt, more fiery, and sometimes controversial. But it was clear that the core message was the same. By the mid-1990s, Billy knew the time was coming to hand over the reins. In 1995, he formally announced Franklin as his chosen successor for the preaching ministry. It was a proud moment for father and son. Imagine the prodigal son not only returning, but taking up the mantle of the father. That's basically what happened. Franklin, who once ran from the spotlight, was now leading crusades. Though they started calling them festivals or celebrations instead of crusades, he was preaching to tens of thousands of people, in places from Tallahassee to Thailand, telling them about the same Jesus that his father had introduced to so many. The wild child had fully come home. One thing everyone notices is that Franklin is not a carbon copy of Billy, and he doesn't try to be. We preach the same gospel, but Daddy hates to say no, and I can say no, Franklin once told Newsweek. That pretty much sums it up. Billy Graham was gentle diplomatic, always finding common ground. Franklin, on the other hand, is more of a straight shooter. He doesn't shy away from saying things that might ruffle feathers. Over the years, he's been quite outspoken on social and political issues from a Christian conservative perspective, which has earned him both supporters and critics. But that's Franklin. He'll tell it like he sees it. And if that steps on toes, so be it. He also has a bit of a swashbuckling side. He's been known to ride his Harley-Davidson motorcycle to speaking engagements, and he often wears a leather jacket when he preaches at biker rallies or informal events. It's all part of his persona, the rebel with a cause, which, fittingly, is the title of his autobiography. Despite the edgywiness, those who know him say Franklin has a big heart and deeply cares about bringing people to faith and helping those in need. Under Franklin's leadership, Samaritan's Purse grew into a global relief powerhouse, responding to hurricanes, earthquakes, war crises, you name it all, in the name of Jesus. He also took on the presidency of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, BGEA, meaning he wears two big hats to this day. One moment he might be coordinating sending an emergency field hospital to a disaster zone, and the next moment planning an evangelistic festival in a major city. It's a lot to juggle, but Franklin thrives in it. He often says he's motivated by seeing lives changed, whether through physical aid or the gospel message. And though he once resisted the pulpit, he ended up preaching in over 50 countries, continuing the work his father began. In recent years, Franklin led the BGEA's Decision America tour, traveling to every U.S. state capital to hold prayer rallies, urging the nation to turn back to God. A very bold and urgent style of outreach that is his signature. On the personal front, Franklin has been much more steady than his youth might have predicted. He married his wife Jane in 1974 and has remained married to her ever since. Together they have 4 children and a bunch of grandchildren. One of his sons, Will Graham, has also stepped into evangelistic ministry, representing the 3rd generation of Grahams to preach. Another of Franklin's children is a speaker and married a professional football player. And yes, one of Gigi's sons, Tulian Chvigian, also became a pastor. There are a lot of Grahams and extended Grahams in ministry today. Franklin, now in his early 70s, shows no signs of slowing down. He's often in the news, whether for delivering aid in some far-flung place or for his frank comments on cultural issues, and he doesn't mind the attention as long as he can point people to the hope of the gospel. Number 1 Nelson Ned Graham, born in 1958. Ned's story is perhaps the most surprising and, in some ways, the most quietly impactful. If Franklin was the prodigal who came roaring back, Ned was the quiet wanderer who took a very different route, one that led him across the world and through some deep valleys of personal struggle. Ned was just a boy when his father's evangelistic career was at its peak. And by the time he was a teenager, all his older siblings had left home. Being the baby of the family, he had a somewhat different experience. Some say he was his mother Ruth's favorite, coddled a bit more since he was the last one at home. But that didn't spare Ned from the common grandkid challenge of living in an extraordinary family. During his youth, Ned struggled to find his place. He wasn't naturally drawn to the spotlight or leadership like some of his siblings. In fact, for a time, Ned drifted into rebellion and darkness in his own way. While Franklin's rebellion was loud and outward, Ned's was more secretive and potentially more dangerous. He fell into substance abuse, experimenting with drugs, and it went beyond casual teenage mischief. Ned later admitted that he got heavily into drugs like cocaine to the point where it became a serious problem. It's hard to imagine Billy Graham's youngest son high on cocaine, but that was the reality for a while. Ned was searching for something escape excitement, maybe just the attention he missed with an often absent father. Whatever the reasons, he went down a destructive path. But through it all, something remarkable happened. His parents never gave up on him. Billy and Ruth Graham, as busy as they were, showed Ned unconditional love even at his worst. They expressed concern and displeasure over the behavior, but never once did they make me feel they rejected me as a person, Ned said of that time. The Graham home was always open to him, no matter what shape he was in. Billy and Ruth prayed and waited with patience and grace, and eventually that love drew Ned back. He later reflected that their grace towards him was irresistible. It melted his heart and helped him turn a corner. Ned's turnaround wasn't an overnight altar call moment like you might hear in some testimonies. It was a gradual journey of inner healing. He attended college and later even went to seminary, showing that his faith was rekindled. Ned earned a master's degree from Fuller Theological Seminary, preparing for ministry. For a few years, he served as a pastor at a church in Washington state, focusing on adult ministries. One might have expected him to eventually join his father or siblings in the more public F-facing ministry. But Ned felt a tug in a very different direction, one that was actually near and dear to his parents' hearts. Ministry in the Far East, specifically China. Here's a fascinating twist. Billy Graham's wife, Ned's mom, Ruth Graham, grew up in China as the daughter of medical missionaries, and she always had a lifelong love for the Chinese people. Billy himself also had a deep respect and concern for China, so it's almost poetic that Ned became the one to focus on that part of the world. In the early 1990s, Ned co-founded an organization called Eastgates Ministries International, based in Washington state. The mission of Eastgates was to serve the growing Christian church in China, not in an underground illegal way, but working within legal channels to support Chinese believers. This was delicate, even dangerous work at times. Ned and his team helped with things like legally distributing Bibles in China, training church leaders, and providing resources to the Chinese church, which was experiencing explosive growth after years of persecution. Imagine a young Graham quietly meeting with Chinese officials, negotiating to bring tens of thousands of Bibles into the country, or encouraging house church pastors. That's what Ned devoted himself to. He wasn't seeking the limelight. In fact, for years, many people had no idea what Billy Graham's youngest son was up to. But behind the scenes, Ned was making a real difference for Christianity in a part of the world where open evangelism wasn't possible. However, Ned's personal life continued to have struggles. He married in the 1980s and had 2 sons, and for a while it seemed he had a stable family life. Unfortunately, after 19 years, that marriage ended in divorce. The pain of divorce struck the Graham family again, and Ned went through a pretty tumultuous period in the late 1990s. It became public enough that there were some concerns and controversies around him, including reports of continued struggles with alcohol. Ned stepped down for a time to get help. He went through rehab for substance abuse and sought spiritual counseling. He later described battling what he felt was demonic oppression, a deep spiritual battle that had him in a very dark place. It takes humility to admit that, and Ned did. He reached a point of desperation and cried out to God for deliverance. In a Charisma magazine interview, Ned shared that he experienced a profound inner healing through prayer. Something changed in him on a spiritual level. He even said God gave him a new prayer language, interpreted by some as speaking in tongues, or a refreshed way of communing with God. Ned Graham's story is one of quiet strength, resilience, and faith lived away from the limelight. While his siblings often took on more visible roles within the public ministry or media, Ned's calling led him down a different road, one marked by humility, service, and steadfast dedication to those who live out their faith under the most difficult of circumstances. After enduring the heartbreak of divorce, Ned rebuilt his life step by step, finding healing and renewed purpose. His marriage to Christina Tina Kuo was not just a personal blessing, but also a partnership rooted in shared faith and ministry. Together they built a home in the Pacific Northwest, raising his 2 sons in a nurturing environment far removed from the glare of constant public attention. For Ned, family became both an anchor and a daily reminder of God's grace in restoring broken seasons of life. Professionally, his leadership of Eastgates Ministries became the defining work of his calling. While others might have chased platforms and recognition, Ned quietly pursued the mission field of Asia, particularly China. His efforts in partnering with Chinese church leaders, supporting underground networks, and helping to distribute countless Bibles to believers who had never owned their own scripture reflect the heart of a man more interested in impact than applause. For those who received those precious books, Ned's ministry wasn't just about paper and ink, it was about hope, dignity, and the reassurance that they were not forgotten. Within the Graham family itself, Ned has often been described as a gentle mediator and principled voice. His defense of his mother, Ruth's burial wishes, even when it meant standing in respectful disagreement with his brother Franklin, revealed the loyalty and conviction that define his character. He wasn't afraid to differ when it mattered, and yet he did so with grace, protecting his mother's legacy while maintaining the bonds of family unity. Today, as the decades have passed, Ned Graham continues to live largely outside of the spotlight. Friends and colleagues speak of his humility, his deep commitment to prayer, and his quiet but unwavering compassion for the persecuted church. He represents a different kind of legacy within the Graham family. Not the booming voice filling stadiums, but the quiet presence that brings comfort, encouragement, and truth in small, powerful ways. Perhaps that is what makes Ned's life so meaningful. In a family name synonymous with global influence, his story reminds us that faithfulness is not always measured in headlines or numbers. Sometimes it is measured in quiet perseverance, in standing firm when others waver, and in serving faithfully in places where few will ever see. Ned Graham has carried his father's legacy in his own way, not with fanfare, but with the steady hand of a servant leader who found strength in humility and joy in simply being faithful.